Now, I'd like to present our first speaker. Dr. Johannes Doemer is one of the occupational hygienists at WorkSafeNB since 2019, assisting the workplace in the anticipation and reduction of health hazards to prevent occupational diseases. He holds a PhD in chemistry from the University of Munster in Germany and has extensive background in specific research, health, and safety. Over to you.
Good morning, and thank you for the nice introduction. Yes, good morning, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to talk today and to speak about something about a fairly significant lung and health hazard and what we can do to protect our workers. I will share my screen, and I hope that works. Perfect. Okay, great. Again, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And my topic is respirable silica, significant health hazard, significant lung hazard, actually, that a lot of workers in New Brunswick are facing. And I not only want to talk about the hazard and what it can do to our bodies, but I also want to talk about what we as WorkSafe in collaboration with MBCSA are doing in order to help employers in New Brunswick protect their employees from this hazard and hopefully have a significant impact, a positive impact on the lung health of New Brunswick workers. So let's start by looking at respirable silica itself. What is respirable silica? And starting with silica. Silica itself is a highly common natural mineral, maybe the most common natural mineral on Earth's crust. Is part of sand, rock, gravel. So from that alone, you can see, well, this is very abundant in our nature. The form that we are concerned about is really the crystalline silica. Sometimes you hear the word quartz or alpha quartz, that we typically use that interchangeably. And you can see in this short listing already some of the materials that contain silica and their percentages. And from this list alone, I mean, granite is on there, concrete, sand, brick, asphalt, that a lot of the materials that are all around us pretty much contain silica. And if we particularly think about construction sites, construction activities, those activities would handle a lot of these materials and therefore are particularly dangerous, of course. Engineered artificial stone is also on the list. That's kind of a special breed. We can talk about that a little bit later. But very high silica content, and it seems also very easy to liberate respirable silica from this material. So there have been studies shown that that is a significant additional hazard, let's say, but maybe we can talk about that a little later. So silica itself, in let's say its bulk form or as it's embedded in the material, is not the issue. Of course, it becomes the issue and it becomes a lung hazard when we make it airborne. So when we have any process that is dust generating that involves any material that is silica containing. So we see here the front end loader there, like mechanical moving of that material. Sandblasting is a big one, of course. Cutting concrete or cutting any material that contains silica, really grinding, polishing is another concrete cutting device. So virtually any activity that we have that creates a dust and that impacts silica-containing material logically makes it airborne. And once it's airborne, yes, we can breathe it in, and it becomes a concern for our lung health as well. Naturally, if we have a process that liberates a lot of dust, typically those are power tools. You can see that from these pictures as well. The risk is elevated. The amount of dust released into the air is significantly higher than when we treat something with the power of our hands. So if you look at these photos or at some of the processes I was describing and think about, well, who is performing these processes and who is particularly performing these processes with silica-containing material, it brings you to the list of individuals who might be at particular risk. So logically, construction sides is construction activities are fairly high on the list. If you look at the construction side, a lot of the activity of a construction site would have the potential for respirable silica exposure. Have equipment of operators, of course, all kinds of construction trades. Really, virtually anything that happens there, depending on the site, really just being on the site because the ground might be dusty. It might simple disturbance of equipment running over it might be enough to lead to silica exposure. So all of those considerations for construction are naturally we have to be in place, and construction is again fairly high up on the list in terms of industries that are impacted by this and that are exposed to this risk of respirable silica. But also other industries like agriculture, mining, of course, depending what you mine and where. But logically, if you dig through the earth and you dig through an area that has silica-containing material, yes, you're running into that issue quite a bit. Certain types of manufacturing would also be impacted by the risk of respirable silica. So I already mentioned the issue becomes when silica is released into the air. Now, we're not concerned about all of the silica that is released into the air, and this is where this term respirable comes into place. It's really the very small size fraction of this dust that we are concerned about. So the respirable fraction, and typically we refer that to below 4 micrometers. That is the fraction that can travel all the way down into your lungs, into the alveoli, and from there can deposit there and can really create the bigger hazard. We're not as much concerned about the bigger size fractions, the larger particles. Our upper respiratory systems can filter that out. And yes, workable knows at the end of the day, and it looks a bit gross, but that's not what we're concerned about. What we're concerned about is really the respirable fraction that is invisible to the naked eye. I know I'm preaching a little bit to the choir here. You probably know more about lung health than I do, but from a risk perspective, it's really the invisible fraction of the dust cloud that we're concerned about, and that is a point that is worth driving home, because people always assume, well, okay, I see dust, I'm concerned, and I don't see dust, and I'm fine. In a lot of situations, we can take dust cloud, so to say, as a proxy, can look at that and do part of our risk assessment based on this visual determination of where is the dust cloud. But in reality, that is just assuming that part of that visible dust is our invisible respirable fraction. And in other words, there's also no guarantee that if you don't see a dust cloud, you're fine, right? One of the things I always say is that kind of the worst thing you can do to respirable or to silica dust is try to pick it up with a normal vacuum. That's not HEPA filtered or high efficiency filtration, because that just takes out the core stuff and blows the respirable fraction back into the air, and then nobody sees anything and everybody thinks they're protected, but in reality they aren't. So respirable really refers then to the size fraction of the dust. What does that mean then from health effects? What does it mean for our body? The primary disease we're concerned about here is silicosis. So silicosis is really scarring of the lung tissue, a form of fibrosis, I guess. The more of these silica particulates that you get deposited in your lungs, the more scarring can occur. Eventually, breathing becomes difficult. We have no known cure for this, and it's fatal depending on the severity. There are some there's some parallels with asbestosis, also from just a mechanical perspective, right? In both cases, we have a foreign material sticking in our lung tissue and creating scarring around that and creating then the health effect in the long term. Also, silicosis has been termed by some people as kind of the new asbestosis. We don't want to get there. We still have a fairly high number of cases of asbestosis, of course, because we had highly exposed populations. We don't want to get there with silica for sure, and that's why also a part of the reason why we put measures in place to counteract this now and to prevent it from becoming a really widespread issue. We differentiate in terms of silicosis now different types just based on the time frame: chronic silicosis, latency period of 10 to 20 years, accelerated silicosis 5 to 10 years, and acute silicosis. That's a fairly new term or development, I guess, based on more or less recent studies. A lot of those involve artificial stone, very, very high exposure in those situations, in those work situations. And there have been actually studies shown or cases where comparatively young workers have been exposed only over a few months to again, very high levels of respirable silica and developed silicosis in exposure times below a year. So that is for chronic lung disease, that is a very, very short exposure time and a quite concerning scenario, of course. Luckily in New Brunswick, that's not necessarily the situation, but we have studies from Australia, for instance, where that's clearly illustrated. Lung cancer is also a high risk of lung cancer is also associated with silica exposure. It's not necessarily too surprising, considering yes, you have foreign material stuck into your lung tissue at that point. We have a short video here from our friends at WorkSafe BC that summarizes nicely what we talked about so far and also has a nice animation. So I'll share that and I'll hope you can hear that. Just let me know that the sound is coming through okay. Yes, I apologize for that. I can drop the link to the video if you're interested into the chat after. But again, the animation might be worth it. I had the audio fairly clear, so I couldn't hear much else, but apologize for that. Anyway, I guess the biggest point is that, yes, those tiny little silica particulates travel all the way deep into your lungs and deposit there, or being deposited there from scar tissue, and eventually breathing becomes difficult, or the lung is damaged to a degree that really silicosis occurs. Now that we established respirable silica is not good for us, the next logical question would be, well, how much is then too much? Like at which point does it become dangerous? And I like this graphic and this analogy because it illustrates how little is really needed. So the amount of silica dust that you can fit on Abraham Lincoln's forehead on an American penny, you can see that here, is enough to overexpose people in a 10 by 10 foot room. So that just as a reminder, it doesn't need much. It doesn't need much. And luckily, if you look at the typical silica or concrete dust cloud, a lot of that material is, of course, not respirable. It's too big, but it doesn't need much of the respirable material itself, if that's airborne, to overexpose individuals. We do have an occupational exposure limit, so a maximum concentration that workers in New Brunswick are allowed to be exposed to. And this has changed in the last 3 years, I believe, has dropped down to 0.025 milligrams per cubic meter over 8 hours. So we have an exposure limit, but can somebody look at a work process or at a dust cloud and say, well, this is above 0.025 or this is, let's say, 0.04, so we have to do something about it? Or if somebody can, let them send me their contact information because we would be interested in talking to that person. But no, of course, that's not possible. So what that means is that employers or people responsible for the work site would have to do air testing to determine what actually the levels of respirable silica are in the air. And our regulation actually speaks to this. So we have a clause that essentially says where an employer has, or where there is reason to believe that the level of concentration of an air contaminant may approach 50%, so half of the occupational exposure limit, then the employer has to make sure that the air is tested to determine the exact concentration. And that typically, classically, looks like this. So we have an identification step. That means we have gone through the process of identifying. Okay, we have a task here that can lead to Silica exposure. In this case, let's say concrete cutting. And we do an evaluation, and that means we have to get the air tested. We have here a typical test setup. So we have a pump. That blue thing there is a pump, and we draw air through a filter media. There's a pre-selector on the filter that makes sure that only the respirable fraction of the dust is being captured by the filter. So the worker does their task. You can see that he's cutting concrete here, and he has the pump on his waist, connected with the tubing to the filter and the pre-selector that's just in front of his breathing zone. And then we let the worker do his shift and collect the sample afterwards, send the sample to the lab. The lab will eventually respond to us with a report on how much silica was found on that filter, and then we can go back to the worker and say, hey, remember that concrete cutting that you did 3 weeks ago? You were actually overexposed doing that or not, depending on the scenario. So, of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit with the timeline, but it illustrates one issue of the air sampling. It's also retroactive. It's difficult to put proactive controls into place if we rely only on air sampling. And if you think of work sites like construction sites, very dynamic, tasks overturn very quickly. That concrete cutting that he's doing that day might not occur again on that specific construction site, right? So by the time you get the result in a non-static workplace like this, it's often too late, and up till that point is often a bit of guesswork. So this is really where our Silica Control Tool comes in. So the Silica Control Tool is an online risk assessment tool. It's essentially a database of more than 5,000 of these types of personal silica measurements that I just went through. So there was a big database. I think Quebec hosted that, University of Quebec. And BCCSA took that database and built some math around it and created an online risk assessment tool that now allows users to input their task into the tool, and the tool will estimate the exposure to respirable silica when that specific task is being performed. So this has been developed by BCCSA, so it's the Construction Safety Association of BC. We are now the third jurisdiction that adopts that tool. So BC did. The tool is live in Ontario as well. It's not as integrated into the legislation there as it is here or in BC, but they have it. And now, in cooperation with our Construction Safety Association, with NBCSA, we were able to bring this tool to New Brunswick last year. So now New Brunswick employers have free access to this tool and can use it free of charge to essentially generate exposure estimates for their task. So what the tool does is it creates task-specific silica exposure estimates, it's called. So it really, like you put in, and I can show screenshots in a moment, but you put in your task, you put in what you're doing, and the tool will tell you, okay, this is the level of exposure that you're expecting in that. In that, it can do that controlled and uncontrolled, which is a nice feature and very educational from that perspective as well. The tool itself, just walking through the tool, is very educational. It's an online tool that is built really step by step. You don't need any prior knowledge of respirable silica or of lung health or of occupational hygiene for that matter. Very minimal to effectively use it, and it teaches you a lot along the way. There's a lot of reading and clicking on continue, but it teaches you a lot along the way if you spend a bit of time with it. There's also a lot of information in the background that can be accessed through the tool, which is a great resource. It's very easy to use. So as I said, it's kind of point and click and clicking on continue and selecting your parameters and going to the next page. Very easy to use. From a documentation perspective, and that's also good for us, it produces exposure control plans. So it documents everything along the way. And that can be used, of course, for worker education on site, but it can also be used to check if the implementation of this is correct by us, but also by, and that's a typical scenario on construction sites, by the hiring organizations who might not be experts in construction or silica or hazards on a construction site. But this is a very easy way to confirm from the hiring organization perspective that the contractor is doing the right thing. So very nice from that perspective as well. So here just a screenshot. So I'm going to walk you through some of the aspects of that tool. This is the task input. So you select your material. There's a drop-down list of different different silica-containing materials. So in this case, concrete was selected. You select the task. What are you doing? In this case, jackhammering, so breaking with the jackhammer. And then depending on the task, there might be different tools that can be used for this. I mean, this one is fairly straightforward. So it would be a jackhammer. Then the user selects where is this happening, outside, inside, or in a confined area, and roughly how long the time frame for that is per day. So less than 4 hours, 4 to 8 hours, or longer than 8 hours per shift. And that is already enough information for the tool to give a first exposure estimate. So the tool then takes a look at, well, what is our data set? What does our data set to this say to this? Do we have enough measurements to confidently say, if you do this task out in the real world, out on a construction site, this is going to be your exposure level?
Johannes, you have 2 minutes.
Oh, wow. Okay, I'm a bit slower than I thought. Okay, good. I'll hurry along a little bit. So you have your exposure analysis. This assumes no controls. It relates it directly to your exposure limit, which is also nice. And then you can go further and select different control options. So the control options that are integrated into the tool are based on what we use the hierarchy of controls, which speaks to which control option is more effective than the other. Engineering controls are always preferred over something like personal protective equipment, because we know that personal protective equipment is kind of the last line of defense. So the tool allows you to select different control options. I'm going to zoom in just on the engineering control. So depending on the task you selected, there are different engineering controls available, and you can select one and then continue on. And as you do that, you get a second exposure analysis now with controls. And the nice feature about this is you can really use it for planning purposes as well. Right, you can see which control is effective, and we see here it moved the needle in the right direction, not quite the way that we can use it without respiratory protection, but at least we reduced our dust by, 86%, so quite significantly by integrating water into the process. So the contractor or the user can actually see how effective is my engineering control, and how much reduction do I get from that. The tool will then take this final exposure analysis and relay it to the information like what kind of respiratory protection would be needed when performing this task. So it does that by just checking the required protection factor, and this stems from CSA standards that we cite in regulations, and would then dictate, in this case, for instance, okay, a half-phase respirator would have to be used. As I said, we can skip over this, but this is just based on our CSA standards, the different protection factors for the different types of respirators that we see. The tool will create an exposure control plan, as I mentioned, PDF document that contains some summary information, and that is very useful because it allows for fairly quick compliance check. And again, that can be done by us, by our offices, or by anybody who has authority over that site, but might not be as familiar with construction activity. It's a typical scenario on construction sites. So you can just check, is a Silica process used on site? If so, yes, we would expect that Silica Control Tool is being used and exposure control plan is present, or that air monitoring results are available. Then we would simply check, does the process that's documented match what we're seeing on site? Do the controls implemented match what we're seeing on site? And finally, does the respiratory protection we're seeing match or exceed what's documented in the exposure control plan? So fairly simple to use. We introduced this last year. We have numerous resources online now. Here's the link to the Silica Control Tool itself. We have a safety topic on our website, WorkSafeNB.ca, that summarizes the risk of respirable silica, of course, links to the tool and provides some additional resources, including things like what information do I need to create an account? And again, that's free for any given for any employer in New Brunswick. And the website would walk you through that. There's also a video on how to use the tool, but most of that is very self-explanatory. And there's a lot of help and FAQs both on our website as well as in the tool itself. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope I stayed within those 2 minutes. Thanks for your attention. And if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer those.
There's no questions. So thank you, Johannes, to join us. It was very good.